The throne is yours. I've grown weary of this empty power. Take it if you wish. I promise to serve and guide you as your Seneschal until you grow comfortable with the position. But who among you shall rule?
Hello and welcome, my friends and viewers, to this week's episode of Legendlore, where I draw and talk about monsters, characters, gods, and other things from D&D 5th edition, while giving a small but quickly digestible history about them. Together we go over their history within the game, how they're utilized in the modern edition, and how you guys can utilize them in your own games. Today we will be delving into the lore and history of Jergal, god of death, the Scribe of the dead, and the subject of one of the most interesting and impactful stories in the entire mythos of the Forgotten Realms. Jergal is known by many titles, including the Lord of the End of Everything, the Scribe of the Doomed, the Bleak Seneschal, and Protector of the Names of the Dead, just to name a few. The Bleak Seneschal in particular refers to his servitude as second hand to a number of various gods of death, all varied in their intent, portfolio, and morality. The most famous of them would be Mordrym, Cyric, and finally Kelemvor, but it is important to note that Jergal was the true, original god of death in the Forgotten Realms. How he became Seneschal? Well, he grew to find that he appreciated the accounting and orderliness that came with watching over the fate of the world, and so he seated himself as the chamberlain to whichever poor soul came to claim the title of God of Death. This brings me to my favorite part of Jergal's backstory, the time that he decided to give up his power to a trio of mortals both stupid and brave enough to approach him, them being the then mortals, soon-to-be gods, Bane, Baal, and Mordrym, the second of which has been covered in a previous legend lore. All of them were destined to transcend mortality and become gods, and all three approached Jergal with a want of his position. As the three argued with one another about who would truly ascend to godhood, Jergal calmed them and removed his bone knuckles before throwing them to the floor. A game of knucklebones is what he decided would be the one to allow who would pick which domain to take first, and it ended with Bane getting his domain of strife, Baal getting his domain of murder, and Mordrym getting his domain over the dead themselves. From here, he diminished and placed himself in service of Mordrym as the Seneschal of Death, and served the gods Cyric and Kelemvor when they both usurped godhood for themselves. With this in mind, Bane, Baal, and Mordrym seem to be the closest thing to allies that Jergal has, giving them his power out of boredom but allowing himself to remain in service of the bureaucracy of death. Despite his reservations and the desire for increased levels of death, Jergal worked really well with the just Kelemvor and held scorn for the chaotic, power-hungry Cyric. The god of Velsharun's focus on undeath to prolong life also earned him Jergal's ire. As death is his primary focus and desire, gods of life innately oppose Jergal in his ways, and resurrection is not something he would be keen on to have his followers use unless he had a good enough reason to do so. In terms of his tenets, clergy, and religion, Jergal's holy symbol is identified as a skull with a scroll seated inside of its teeth. He is identified as being lawful neutral in alignment and carries the knowledge and death domains in his 5th edition incarnation, though I do like to add grave for those special occasions. Jergal's church is often referred to as the Scriveners of Doom, a small but well-organized monastic order based predominantly in places of death and rest, such as crypts, graveyards, and mausoleums. These clerical bureaucrats spend their days focused on writing, maintaining, researching, and updating their vast chronicles on the process of death and the traversal into the afterlife. As such, they rarely tend to perform experiments, summon creatures, or perform the other traditional evil acts of a death god's cult. In this order, I see mostly wizards, clerics, and possibly even druids keen to study the way of decay. Interestingly enough, a small handful of Jergalists still follow an ancient order known as the Way of the Pallid Mask, whose focus is on the removal and/or acquisition of undead whose creation was either not sanctioned by the church or whose presence has grown to be a bit troublesome. In this order, I can see undead smiting paladins, necrotic monks, and even grave clerics and undead rangers fitting in. Jergal's worship mostly blooms in places rife with necromancy and death, such as battlefields or even places such as the land of Thay, where liches rule and death and undeath are both common occurrences. In fact, most worshippers usually seek to attain church-sponsored forms of undeath in order to continue their archiving careers well beyond their natural life. In terms of Jergal-specific rites and rituals, clerics to Jergal pray for their spells at dusk, a time of day representative of the end of life. While most view Jergal's worshippers as a tireless and death-obsessed bunch, the clergy does cease its bureaucratic focus for the night of another year, an aptly named holiday that takes place during the last night of the year. During this time, Jergal's clergy reads every name whose death has been recorded on their scrolls that they have created over the past year, with a cry of 1 year closer, which refers to it being 1 year closer to the day that all things end and Jergal's work is finally done. All the scrolls are then carefully filed, and work begins on the next days to come. Lastly, clerics to Jergal are also required to perform a ritual known as the sealing. After recording each and every creature's place, time, and form of death, as well as their destination in the afterlife, Scriveners of Doom are required to sprinkle a light dusting of ash and powdered bone over their inscribed words to blot the ink. It is a signal of a job well done before moving on to the next one. In terms of the actual god himself, Jergal is said to be cold, unfeeling, and excessively formal, never showing any true form of emotion and speaking in a calm, almost bored tone. Despite this, he is often believed to hold a much darker morality than most of his masters, sanctioning the use and creation of undead by his followers so long as they use them to increase the number of dead in the world. More death means more accounting, and that's where Jergal finds most of his joy. Loyalty to the office of death was part of his very being, and he would actively undermine the deity currently holding the position if they did not stay true to their responsibilities, such as he did with the god Cyric. Now, Jergal's physical appearance was that of either a long-bearded old man or skeleton, always wearing a hooded cloak with the purest black, which was believed to be capable of transporting those who touched it to the plane of negative energy. His favor was often recognized by a disembodied sound of a book shutting closed, and his touch was capable of sapping all life from a creature in seconds. Furthermore, Jergal had a strange fondness for taking on a guise of a being called Nakazir, often appearing to those who knew him by this title as a half-human, half-praying mantis-like creature. In this form, he was said to have an elongated skull, mandibles, and a pair of bulbous, multifaceted eyes like an insect. Torn white gloves covered his clawed hands, and in them was always an endlessly inked quill and a colossal book filled with intricate script. This form was much more alien, and is something that I find both interesting and random in terms of researching him. This form, however, could be very appealing if he seeks to collect aberration worshippers, such as freed mind flayers or beholder death tyrants. Incidentally, I can also see Jergal having a strong cult formed out of Nothics, who are one-eyed aberrations born of wizards who delve too far into eldritch arcane knowledge. Perhaps these Nothics have lost all their senses and transformed after having studied forms and aspects of death too strange for the mortal mind to comprehend, and thus they have flocked to the god Jergal in the hopes that he may educate them further where their previous forms had failed. In terms of flavoring player characters and classes aligned with Jergal, here are some ideas that I have. Barbarians, especially Zealots, can fuel into Jergal's desire for death by hurling themselves into every battle with everything that they have, knowing that both their victory or their defeat can serve the Lord of the Dead. While magic barbarians can be flavored with a literal essence of death emanating from them when they rage, and ancestral guardian barbarians in particular can make use of his allowance of spirits and undeath, so long as they are used to spread more death for him to make accounts of. Bards of various colleges can serve Jergal as well. Lower bards can share his love for note-taking and various aspects of death, and bards of the College of Spirits can consult the wisdom and knowledge of those who have passed on. Whisper bards can also tap into the dark magic that Jergal provides, while swords bards may wish to get their hands and blades dirty in his name. For clerics, Jergal normally holds the domains of knowledge and death when it comes to them, but I would also pose that he can also have clerics of the grave, twilight, and arcana domains as well. Death and knowledge are the two best weapons that Jergal has at his disposal, so fostering clergy that could research magic and manipulate all aspects of both life and death would be in his best interest. For druids, the Spores druids' reverence of decay, ruin, and death fit perfectly with Jergal's tenets, and their affinity for necrobotany can be a nice change of pace, trading in libraries and deep crypts for marshy groves and wisdom etched on wood and stone. Echo Knight fighters can be flavored as weaponizing their soul to conjure a necromantic echo, while Eldritch Knights can research spells and blades to aid in the spread of death. Now when it comes to monks, they, in my opinion, would be just as numerous as clerics in Jergal's order, especially those of the Ways of Mercy, Shadow, Cobalt Soul, and the Long Death. Cobalt Soul monks literally learn how to better kill their enemies the longer that they fight them. Long Death and Mercy monks both manipulate life forces of their foes in different ways, and the Shadow monk would be an exceedingly deadly assassin keen to carry out Jergal's work. In terms of paladins, those of Vengeance can swear to return those resurrected and stolen from the Lord of Death back to death, and an Oathbreaker can absolutely turn to Jergal after having broken away from the path of a life deity, or even another death god whose path was simply too untenable for them. Rangers who hunt undead can serve Jergal's Order of the Pallid Mask, as well as touch upon Jergal's wish for the death of extraplanar beings such as celestials, fiends, or aberrations. Murderous rogues of all sorts can find themselves into Jergal's service, especially the spectral phantom, the clear-cut assassin, or the magically aided arcane trickster. For sorcerers, shadow sorcerers can be born from the lineage touched by Jergal, either by having the ancestor once be in his service, or the character having been brought back from death after encountering the bleak Seneschal. The undead patron for warlocks would fit as an agent tasked by Jergal to find a resurrected soul and return it to its rightful state of passing, and he can certainly give a powerful weapon for which a hexblade may deal sufficient death. The Great Old One Pact is also an interesting angle to go for, playing on Jergal's age and the great deep lore and deaths that he has seen and record. One must always remember that Jergal records the end of all things, be they mundane and normal, or eldritch and unknowable. And finally, for wizards, those of the divination school can nudge and manipulate the path of fate for others to meet their own ends. Scribe wizards literally embody the concept of note-taking and bureaucracy, and necromancy wizards would have to keep to his strict teachings on the practice of undeath, but could also be very useful. Ultimately, when building a character that is going to be aligned with Jergal, the focus is always going to be on Jergal's bureaucratic accounting, and wanted to keep the concept of life and death orderly. Resurrections and undead and summoning and all that other sort of stuff can really muddy up the whole accounting, and Jergal's very keen on keeping that nice and tidy. But there are definitely ways to portray this in both positive and negative lights. As such, here are a few NPCs that I came up with for you guys to use in your games. The first one is Remus, Jergal's bounty hunter. Remus is a reborn undead warlock, brought back to a half-life by Jergal to serve as his personal reaper upon the material plane. Remus's sole objective is to find the souls of those who have eluded death, be that by narrowly escaping with their life, or cheating by being returned to the land of the living by resurrection magic. Discrepancies in Jergal's numbers cannot be abided by, no matter which god is interloping, and Remus is tasked with returning those stolen lives back to the grave, and ensuring that they cannot be resurrected again by destroying the body, or hiding it away from a party who's keen to see that person remain living. Remus's versatility allows him to fit a number of roles when encountering the party. He can be a sinister bounty hunter with a sick indulgence for his craft, or a very cunning thinker who may parley with his target in order to foster the death of other people, bestowing upon them a quest in order to save their own lives. You could even have him serve as a simple comic relief if you really want, but the focus is either that Remus will focus on getting his own target, or getting his target to spread more death in his place. Next, we have the quiet and discerning Hafestus, a monk of the Way of Cobalt Soul who, rather than studying death and the dead after their passing, prefers to have an active hand at studying the resistances, vulnerabilities, and immunities of the creatures they encounter. He travels the world and involves himself in all manner of conflict and action in order to study the dead and dying up close, be it serving as a hireling in a hospice dedicated to another god, a hired hand for an adventuring party, or a mercenary battling on one or both sides of a war, taking life by the dozens. Hafestus seeks only study. He doesn't really care about how he achieves that goal. To him, mortality is a function of life, so he doesn't trouble himself with the acts or ideas of good and evil, only what really provides him with results. As such, you can put him in conflict with the party if he's currently getting research from a source they've aligned against, or vice versa. They could possibly convince him that traveling with them would provide a much more interesting level of education. In this depiction, I've made him a tiefling, but you could really go with any sort of ancestry for him. And then finally, we have the more boisterous and obviously villainous character of Mordrym, the Zealot of the Bleak Seneschal. Mordrym's story is even simpler than Hafestus's. Spread death or die in the name of Jergal. Armed with a curved greatsword forged from the rib of a giant, Mordrym scours the land to add numbers to Jergal's accounts, either as a bounty hunter, bandit, or by serving in the crusades of another god while secretly dedicating those he kills to the Lord of the Dead. I personally love the idea of characters serving in churches to be revealed to serve other gods and purposes, and Mordrym can fit into that role either by serving as a zealot barbarian or even an oathbreaker paladin. Your party can encounter him either as a vicious bloodhound of a church who heads bloody crusades and witch hunts, or as a soldier who forsook his old oath in favor of serving Jergal, either as a mercenary or doing so secretly within the church that he has lost faith in. Finally, in terms of a quest that you can give your players that is aligned with Jergal, your players could be dealing with a very tough enemy who is extremely elusive and not a lot of information is known about. But they do discover that there is a old chronicler who serves Jergal who records the weaknesses and strengths of all things that they can. If they hope to understand anything about this creature and how to kill it, they will need to travel deep into the underground and find the ancient crypt that this recorder is seated in. This could be a great way for your players to be exposed to A, Jergal's worship, and B, to learn about how to fight a monster before going in and encountering it. And lastly, for this week's homebrew magic item, everybody, we have a spellbook, a little tome known as the Record of the Slain. This book, made out of hardened leather and bronze, bears a small slot where a black quill sits, one that eternally emanates ink no matter how much or how little you write. It could be attuned to by any spellcaster so long as they have an intelligence of 13 or higher, and upon doing so, they gain access to the following spells. For first level, there's Inflict Wounds, Illusory Script, and Hex. For second level, there is Zone of Truth and Gentle Repose. For third level, there is Intellect Fortress, Summon Shadowspawn, Speak with Dead, and Vampiric Touch. For fourth level, there is Divination and Leomund's Secret Chest. And for fifth level, there is Scrying, Enervation, and of course, Legendlore. These spells are considered added to the spell list that the attuned creature can choose from when preparing their spells, or can be selected from as spells known if they are not a prepared spellcaster. In addition to the extra spells, upon the death of a creature, the wielder of the spellbook can pluck the quill from the book's cover and sign their signature upon the body as a bonus action, once per short rest. So long as it's done within 2 rounds of the creature's death, doing so binds the soul to the book, allowing the wielder a degree of protection. While the soul is bound to the book, the next critical hit that the attuned creature would suffer is treated as a normal hit, at which the soul is consumed and sent to Jergal for accounting. The book can only have one soul in it at a time. Hopefully this tome would give you guys a little bit more staying power for those pesky crits, as well as give you access to a few more divination and necromancy spells for any spellcaster that is not a wizard. I've put the magic item stat block in the description below for you guys. And that's Jergal, the Lord of the Dead, everybody. I want to thank all you guys for watching, and if you guys really enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe, and comment down below. And if you guys want to vote on the next Legendlore, please follow the link in the description or check out the community tab. This week it's going to be monsters between the Behir, the Catablebus, and the Roper. And lastly, please let me know how you guys have encountered Jergal in your games, what kind of characters that you made that were aligned with him, and also what you guys would like to see in upcoming videos. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.